A man who spent 42 years building walls met a woman who spent 34 years learning how to walk through them. He tried to humiliate her in front of an entire town. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She picked up her bag, looked him dead in the eye, and said, "I've seen harder country than you." That was the moment Grant Mercer made the worst mistake of his life, and the best thing that ever happened to him. If you want to know how one woman dismantled a corrupt empire and rebuilt a broken man at the same time, stay until the end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach was 20 minutes late, which meant Grant Mercer had been standing in the middle of Red Hollow's main street for 20 minutes longer than he'd planned, and every single person in town had noticed. He could feel them watching from the general store porch, from behind the barbershop window, from the feed and grain across the road where old Pete Calloway was pretending to count sacks of oats he'd already counted 3 times. This was the problem with small towns. There was no such thing as private business. The moment word got out that Grant Mercer had written to one of those agencies back east for a bride, Red Hollow turned it into a community event. Dorothy Hines at the post office probably read the return letters before she even sealed them back up. Grant wouldn't have been surprised. He shifted his weight from his left boot to his right and crossed his arms, then uncrossed them because crossed arms made a man look nervous. And he was not going to look nervous, standing in the middle of his own town, waiting on a woman he'd never met and who'd never met him, and who, for all he knew, was going to step off that stage and turn around and get right back on it. That had happened to a man over in Butte. Wrote 3 months back and forth with a woman from Philadelphia, paid her passage, drove all the way into town, and she took one look at him and said she'd made a terrible mistake. Grant had heard that story from at least 4 different people, and each version got a little worse. In one version, the man cried right there at the station. Grant had his doubts about that part. The stage rounded the far end of the street, wheels throwing up a low cloud of June dust, the horses blowing hard from the hill grade. Tom Briggs was on the box seat as usual, sawing back on the reins with more drama than the situation required. Tom liked an audience. Grant made himself stand still. The coach rolled to a stop in front of the station. Tom climbed down and opened the door, and 2 men got out first. A cattle buyer Grant didn't recognize, and a younger fellow in a clerk's jacket who looked miserable and sunburned. Then a woman's hand appeared on the door frame. She wasn't what he'd pictured. He didn't know exactly what he had pictured. He'd made a point of not picturing too clearly because picturing things too clearly was how a man ended up disappointed. But it wasn't this. She was tall, maybe 5'7", with dark hair pinned up under a traveling hat that had taken some abuse from the road. Her dress was practical, dusty, plain enough. A deep gray blue that matched the color of the sky just before a serious storm. She stepped down from the coach like she'd been stepping off coaches her whole life. No hesitation, no looking around to see who was watching her. She just came down, got her footing on the street, and then she looked up. And that was the problem. Right there. That was the exact moment everything went sideways. She wasn't what he'd been expecting. She had a face that was... It wasn't that she was beautiful in a way that made you forget yourself. It was that she was beautiful in a way that made you suddenly very aware of yourself, aware of what you were wearing and how long it had been since you last had a proper conversation with someone who challenged you. She looked like someone who would challenge you. She had dark eyes that moved quickly, already scanning the street, taking things in, categorizing. And there was something about the way she held her chin that told Grant Mercer she was absolutely not afraid of anything she was looking at, including him. He walked toward her because he had to, because the whole town was watching and there was no way around it now. "Evelyn Cross," he said. It came out flatter than he meant it to. She turned those quick eyes on him. "Grant Mercer." Not a question. "Yeah. It's a long ride from Billings." She pulled off one of her gloves, tucked it into the other, businesslike. "The road past the canyon grade is bad. Someone should look at the bridge support on the east side before winter." He hadn't expected that either. He'd expected, he didn't know, pleasantries, some version of nervousness. "I'll pass that along," he said. She waited. Grant became aware that people were watching from a little closer now. Dorothy Hines had come out of the post office. Pete Calloway had given up on the grain sacks entirely. Even Tom Briggs hadn't climbed back up to the box seat yet. Grant looked at Evelyn Cross. He looked at the way she stood, straight, unhurried, not performing anything for the crowd. and something happened in his chest that he didn't have a name for, something that felt like the moment before a horse spooked, that half second of tension where everything is still and you know something is about to change but you can't stop it. He panicked. There was no other word for it, though he would have bitten his own tongue off before admitting it. He looked at this woman, this unexpected, quick-eyed, bridge-noticing, glove-tucking woman, and he panicked. "I think," he said, and his voice came out louder than he meant because he was talking to the woman in front of him, but part of him was also talking to everyone watching, defending himself against something he hadn't even been accused of yet. "That there's been a misunderstanding." Evelyn's expression didn't change. What kind of misunderstanding? The kind where... He stopped. Started again. "I wrote to the agency. I wrote what I was looking for. A woman who could work, who was suited to this kind of country. I was clear about what I needed." "You were." She said it simply, like she was agreeing that the sky was blue. "I needed someone practical, sturdy, someone who..." And here was where it went wrong, where the panic made him stupid. "I don't know what those people back east told you about what frontier life is actually like, but it's not what a woman like you is equipped to handle." The street was very quiet. He heard Pete Calloway make a sound that might have been a cough. "A woman like me," Evelyn said, still calm, still with that chin held exactly where it had been. "No offense. You're clearly..." He was making it worse. He knew he was making it worse. "You're not what I needed. The arrangement wouldn't suit either of us." He'd meant it as an exit for both of them. He'd meant it as a kind of mercy. She was clearly too fine for what he had, which was a half-broken ranch and a leaking roof on the east wing and more debt than he cared to add up. She'd be better off in some town where she could do something that matched what she was. He'd told himself this later, turning it over in his mind, and sometimes he almost believed it. But that wasn't what it looked like from the street. From the street, it looked like Grant Mercer had just told a woman in front of the entire town of Red Hollow that she wasn't good enough, that she was too much, too polished, too pretty, too whatever she was, not what a rancher needed. The silence stretched. Evelyn Cross looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the people watching. Dorothy Hines with her hand over her mouth, Tom Briggs frowning from the coach box, Pete Calloway having abandoned all pretense of doing anything except watching. She looked at all of them, and something moved behind her eyes that Grant couldn't read. Not hurt, not anger. Something older than either of those things. Then she bent down and picked up her traveling bag. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Her voice was even. "I've crossed 4 states and spent 11 days on various coaches and trains to get here. I've read your letters. I know what your land looks like, how many head you're running, what the water situation is on your south pasture, and what happened to your last 3 hired men." She paused. "I know considerably more about your situation than you do about mine. Before you make a final decision, perhaps you'd like to know who you're actually talking to." She held his gaze for one more second. Then she turned and walked toward the hotel, her back straight, her step unhurried, the traveling bag in her hand like it weighed nothing. Grant stood in the middle of the street and watched her go. Dorothy Hines looked at him like he was something she'd found stuck to the bottom of a boot. He hadn't meant to let her stay at the hotel on his account. He told himself she'd be on the next coach out. There was one going back east on Thursday, and the whole thing would sort itself out. He'd write to the agency and explain. He'd figure it out. She didn't leave on Thursday. By Wednesday afternoon, she'd somehow arranged to take her meals at the same table as Clara Addison, who ran the hotel and knew every piece of business in Red Hollow going back 20 years. By Thursday morning, she'd spent 3 hours in the county land office, which Grant knew because the deputy clerk, a young man named Robbie Ferris, mentioned it when he came by the ranch to drop off some documents that afternoon. "That woman from the stage," Robbie said, very carefully, not looking directly at Grant. "She was in the office all morning, looking at survey maps." "Why?" "Didn't say." Robbie handed over the documents. "She asked a lot of good questions, though." Another pause. "Better questions than most people ask." Grant took the documents and didn't say anything. He went out to the east pasture in the afternoon and walked the fence line that needed mending and told himself he was thinking about the fence. He was not thinking about the fence. He was thinking about the fact that a woman he'd publicly dismissed was sitting in town doing something with survey maps, which made him feel both irritated and, beneath the irritation, something that might have been worried. Not about her, about what she might find, because Grant knew something that most people in Red Hollow didn't know, or at least didn't know clearly enough to act on. He knew that his southern boundary wasn't where it appeared to be on the current county maps. He'd figured this out 2 years ago, stumbling across a set of his father's papers that didn't match anything the county had on record. He tried to look into it and run into walls. The county surveyor's office was slow to respond. The documents kept needing more verification. The lawyer in Billings had charged him $80 and told him it was complicated. Grant had eventually set it aside the way a man with too many problems sets aside the one that isn't actively bleeding. He stood at the fence line in the low afternoon sun and thought about Evelyn Cross asking questions about survey maps. Then he got his tools and started on the fence. She came to the ranch on Friday morning. Grant was in the barn when he heard hooves in the yard and looked out to see her tying a rented horse to the post. She'd traded the traveling dress for something more practical. A dark canvas skirt, heavy boots, a jacket she'd clearly borrowed from someone because it was slightly too big in the shoulders. She had a leather satchel over one arm. She looked around the yard with those quick cataloging eyes, taking in the state of the fence around the chicken coop, the shed with the half-collapsed roof, the woodpile that wasn't where it should be to be useful. She wasn't making a face about any of it. She was just looking. Grant came out of the barn. "You're trespassing," he said. "Technically, the arrangement we made through the agency is still in its probationary period." She held up the satchel slightly. "I have papers if you'd like to review them." He hadn't known there was a probationary period. He was going to have words with that agency. "What do you want?" "To have a conversation." She looked at him steadily. "You've decided something about me based on how I look. I'm suggesting that's not particularly smart given what I know about your situation. My situation is my business. Your situation is also why you're losing land." She said it simply, the way she'd said everything so far without drama, without trying to provoke him. Just a statement of fact. "The southern boundary of your property has been shifted by approximately 40 rods in the last 8 years. I can show you where in the county records if you'd like to see it." Grant looked at her. The morning was very still. One of his horses moved in the paddock. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark said its piece and went quiet. "How do you know that?" he said. "Because I spent yesterday with the survey maps and I'm good at reading them." She let that sit for a moment. "I used to work for a land title company in Ohio, 4 years. I also handled property dispute filings for an attorney in St. Louis for 2 years after that." She tilted her head. "You wrote to the agency that you needed someone practical, someone suited to frontier life." The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile. "I didn't advertise everything I was." Grant leaned against the barn door. He looked at the yard, at the broken shed, at the horse she'd rented from somewhere in town. He thought about 40 rods. He knew what 40 rods meant in practical terms on his land. He knew exactly which pasture it cut into and how much water access it affected. He thought about Conrad Voss, who owned everything to the south and east and had been expanding quietly for the better part of a decade. "Come inside," he said. "I'll put on coffee." The kitchen was not what it should have been. Grant knew this without needing her to say anything about it. The stove needed blacking, the shelves were half-heartedly organized. There was a stack of papers on the table that had been there long enough to develop a kind of permanent presence. He cleared the papers to one side with slightly more force than necessary and put the kettle on. Evelyn sat down at the table without being invited and opened her satchel. She pulled out a notebook and 2 pieces of paper that looked like they'd been carefully copied from something larger. "This is your original boundary as filed by your father in 1867, she said, laying one paper flat. "And this is the current filed boundary." She laid the second paper next to the first. "The difference is here." She put her finger on a line that ran along what should have been the southern edge of Grant's best grazing pasture. He looked at the 2 lines. He looked at the gap between them. 40 rods, he said. 42, actually, at the widest point. She turned the page slightly so he could see it better. But what's more interesting is how it happened. It wasn't one change. It was 3 separate amendments over 8 years, each one small enough to look like a clerical correction, each one filed by the same county surveyor. She paused. who retired 4 years ago to a property near Helena that's considerably nicer than a county surveyor's salary should be able to afford. Grant's jaw had tightened. He could feel it. You got all this from one day in the land office? I got a start from one day in the land office. She turned the notebook toward him, and he could see the pages covered in her handwriting. Neat, dense, organized. I also asked Robbie Ferris some questions he probably shouldn't have answered as thoroughly as he did. The not-quite smile again. He's a very honest young man. So is a golden retriever. She looked at him, and this time there was something different in it. Not surprise exactly, more like a slight recalibration. Like she'd categorized him one way and was considering whether the category was quite right. The surveyor's name was Aldous Pratt, she said, after a moment. He filed amendments on 4 other properties in this valley over the same period. I can get the names of those properties if you want them. She picked up her coffee when he set it in front of her without breaking stride. I'm guessing at least some of those owners lost their ranches in the last 10 years. Sold under pressure, maybe. Or just couldn't figure out where the line went wrong and gave up. Grant sat down across from her. He turned the papers around and looked at them again. He'd known something was wrong. He'd known it in the back of his mind the way a man knows when a machine isn't running right. He could hear the sound of it, the off rhythm of things that should add up but didn't. Why? He said. She looked at him. Why are you doing this? He gestured at the papers. You could have gotten back on the stage. Most people would have. She was quiet for a moment. Not evasive. He was learning the difference already, just actually thinking about it. Because you've got a legitimate problem that someone manufactured deliberately, she said finally. And because I know how to see it, so it seems like a waste not to. She looked at the papers on the table. Also because I left Ohio with a specific reason for wanting to know how to do something with my life that matters. And go home didn't fit that reason. He waited to see if she'd say more. She didn't. All right, he said. She looked up. All right, he said again. Stay the week. We'll see what else you can find. Late, she slept in the room off the kitchen that had been his mother's sewing room, with a latch on the door and a separate entrance off the side porch that she pointed out herself before he had to figure out how to mention it. She brought her things from the hotel on Saturday morning and unpacked them in a way that suggested she'd gotten efficient at unpacking. She was up before him. That surprised him more than it probably should have. The first morning he came into the kitchen and she already had the stove going and was sitting at the table with the notebook open and what looked like an entirely new set of notes. There was coffee on. It was good coffee, better than his, which irritated him slightly in a way he couldn't entirely justify. She looked up when he came in. The fence on your east pasture, she said. 3rd post from the oak. The rot goes all the way to the base. Another heavy snow, and you're losing that whole section. He'd known about the post. He'd been meaning to get to it. Good morning, he said. A brief pause. Good morning. She looked back at her notebook. The water diversion on the South Creek is also worth looking at. Something's been altering the flow. Could be natural silting, but given everything else, I'd want to know for certain. He poured coffee and sat down across from her. You always like this? He said. Like what? Like you woke up 3 hours ago and have already solved half the problems in the county. She considered this seriously, which he hadn't expected. I don't sleep well in new places, she said. I usually get up and work. How long before a place stops being new? Varies. She turned a page in her notebook. Usually once I've found where everything goes. He looked at her over his coffee cup. She was already back in the notes, her pen moving. She had an ink stain on her left index finger from writing. Her hair wasn't fully pinned yet. It was braided over one shoulder, still loose from sleep, and it made her look less like the composed woman from the stage and more like an actual person, which was somehow worse than all the composure had been. He looked away. The east fence post, he said. I'll get to it today. Do you want help? No. He said it too quickly. She didn't react. All right. The problem with having someone competent nearby is that you started to notice all the places where you'd stopped being competent yourself. Grant noticed it by the end of the first week. He'd gotten used to things being in a certain state. Not good, but a certain state he'd learned to tolerate. And having Evelyn Cross in the house reorganizing the tool shed with a logic he couldn't immediately argue with was like having someone hold a lamp in rooms he'd learned to navigate by memory in the dark. Suddenly he could see the walls clearly, and they were worse than he'd realized. She didn't make a production of it, she just did things. She noticed the drainage problem on the north side of the house and redirected it with a shovel and 20 minutes of work. She looked at his account ledger, the one he'd avoided opening for 4 months, and when he came in from the back pasture, it was organized on the table with a note in the margin in her handwriting that said, "Water rights lease from 1871. Has this ever been filed with county?" He stood there and stared at that note for a full minute. The answer was no. He hadn't even known it needed to be filed. His father hadn't mentioned it. It had sat in a box of papers in the back room like a document without a purpose. He knocked on the door of the sewing room that evening. "The water rights lease," he said when she opened it. She pulled the door open wider. She had the ledger on the small table, open to the page in question. "Your grandfather secured a lease on the diversion rights for the South Creek in 1871 from the territorial government," she said. "The lease is renewable, but it has to be registered with the county every 10 years to remain valid. The last renewal was filed by your father in 1882. She looked at him. "It's 1893. He did the math. "So it's lapsed. It's lapsed." She said it without accusation, which was worse somehow than if she'd said it with accusation. "If Conrad Voss knows this, and if he's been monitoring your property the way the boundary changes suggest he has, then he could file a competing claim on those diversion rights at any time. Or he already has and is waiting." She nodded. "That would be my guess." Grant leaned against the door frame. The house was quiet. Outside, one of the mares was moving around in the paddock. He recognized her sound, that particular restless pace she did when the weather was changing. "What do I do?" he said. It cost him something to say it, but he said it. Evelyn looked at the ledger, then back at him. "Tomorrow, first thing, you go to the county seat and file for renewal. I'll write up the documentation tonight. You take it in person, not through the mail. I don't know who handles the mail between here and the county clerk's office. And given the history, I wouldn't trust it." She paused. "Take the original lease with you. Keep it on your person, not in a bag." "You think someone would—" "I think," she said carefully, "that the boundary changes happened over 8 years in small, careful steps, and that takes patience and planning. Patient, planning. People don't stop at one thing." She closed the ledger. "I think you should be more careful than you've been." He stood there for a moment. "All right," he said. He pushed off from the doorframe and started back toward the kitchen, then stopped. "Evelyn." She turned back to the table but looked up. "I was wrong," he said. "On the street. When you got off the stage." He said it the way he did everything, without preamble, without decoration. "That was wrong." She looked at him steadily. "Thank you," she said after a moment. "That took something." He nodded and went back to the kitchen. He sat down at the table and looked at the far wall for a while. And he didn't think about the east fence post or the South Creek or the lapsed water rights lease. He thought about a woman on a dusty street who'd picked up her bag and walked away without breaking, and what that kind of thing costs a person, and what it says about them that they walk instead of break. The ride to the county seat took most of a day. Grant went alone, the way she'd told him. Original lease in his jacket pocket, documentation in his hand, no delays. He got back after dark to find Evelyn at the kitchen table with a man he didn't recognize, papers spread between them. She looked up. "This is Arthur Haynes," she said. "He had the Haynes Creek Ranch until 6 years ago." Haynes was maybe 60, with the kind of face a man gets from a decade of grief and hard weather layered on top of each other. He looked up at Grant with an expression that was equal parts hope and the specific wariness of someone who's been disappointed before by people who seemed like they were going to help. "He lost his ranch," Evelyn said. "Boundary dispute. The same surveyor." Grant looked at the papers on the table. He looked at Arthur Haynes. He pulled out a chair and sat down. "Tell me," he said. Haynes told him. It took about an hour, and by the end of it, Grant's jaw was so tight it ached. It was the same pattern. Small changes, a sudden difficulty with the water access, a legal challenge he didn't have the money to fight, and eventually an offer from Conrad Voss that seemed like mercy at the time because it got him out from under the legal fees. "He didn't steal my ranch," Haynes said with the particular bitterness of a man who's had years to sit with a thing. "He made it impossible for me to keep it and then bought it from me. There's a difference, legally speaking. Doesn't feel different." After Haynes left, Evelyn sat across from Grant and said, "He's the second one I've found. There are others." Grant nodded. "This is bigger than my fence line," he said. "It's bigger than your fence line." He looked at the door Haynes had walked out of. "He's not going to stop because we filed a paper with the county." "No. He's going to know we filed." "Yes. Probably by tomorrow afternoon." She folded her hands on the table. "When he finds out, he'll move. He'll do something to make the filing difficult or challenge your legitimacy, or—" She stopped, considering. "Or he'll come at me. Because I'm the one who knows what I know, and I'm the easiest pressure point he can see." Grant looked at her. "How do you know that's how he thinks?" "Because it's the obvious move." She said it plainly. "I'm new here. I have no standing. I came in on a stagecoach as a mail-order bride and got turned away on the street." She looked at him steadily. "If he wants to discredit what I've found, all he has to do is make people question why I'm here and what I'm after." The kitchen was quiet. "What are you after?" Grant said. It wasn't an accusation, it was just, he needed to know. He needed to understand what kind of ground he was standing on. She held his gaze for a long moment. "I told you, I want to do something with my life that matters." A pause. "And I want to see him pay for what he did to men like Arthur Haynes." "Why?" The question settled between them. She looked at the table, then back up. "Because someone did something like it to my father," she said. "Land in Ohio. Different man, same method. We lost the farm when I was 16. She said it without sentiment, in the same even tone she said everything, but something in the steadiness of it told him exactly how much work that evenness had taken. "The man who did it is still there, still prosperous. Nobody ever proved anything." She looked at him. "I know what these records look like. I know what to find. I spent 4 years in title work learning to see exactly this kind of thing, because if I ever found it, I wanted to know what to do with it." Grant sat with that for a moment. He thought about a 16-year-old girl watching something get taken that should have been kept. He thought about Arthur Haynes's face. He thought about his father's papers in the back room, sitting in a box like a warning that hadn't been decoded in time. "He's going to come at you," Grant said. "You know that." "Yes." "And you're staying anyway." She met his eyes. "I've seen harder country than this," she said. And Grant Mercer, for the second time in his life, heard those words. This time, he understood them. That night he lay awake in the dark and listened to the ranch settle around him. The creak of timber, the distant sound of wind picking up across the south pasture, one of the horses shifting in the paddock. He'd lived in this house his whole life, built on land his grandfather had claimed, and his father had worked into shape, and he'd been slowly losing without quite knowing how to stop it. He thought about Conrad Voss. He'd known the man 20 years, not well. Voss wasn't the kind of man you knew well. He was the kind of man you knew to stay polite to at the dry goods store and not to get sideways with in front of witnesses. He'd always been there, a quiet, steady pressure at the edge of things, buying up land when prices got low and people got tired, always with a reasonable explanation for why each piece had come to him. Grant had never put it together. He'd been too close to his own fence line to see the pattern. He thought about Evelyn finding it in one day with a notebook and a set of survey maps. He thought about what she'd said, that Conrad would come at her because she was the obvious pressure point. He thought about a woman who'd crossed 4 states and 11 days of hard road and still had the composure to note the bridge support on the canyon grade and ask better questions than anyone in the county land office had asked in years. He wasn't going to let Conrad Voss turn that into a liability. He lay in the dark and thought about what that would actually mean, practically, and what he was going to have to do, and what kind of man he was going to have to be to do it. Outside, the wind moved across the south pasture. Somewhere far off, a coyote called once and went silent. Grant Mercer stared at the ceiling of the house he'd been born in, on the land he'd almost lost without seeing it happen, and he made a decision that had nothing to do with the fence line and everything to do with the woman in the room off the kitchen who hadn't broken when she should have and hadn't left when it would have been easy to. He was going to make sure she had something worth staying for. Conrad Voss found out about the county filing on a Tuesday, which was one day faster than Evelyn had predicted. Grant knew because Ed Chambers, who ran the livery stable and had a talent for being in the right place at inconvenient times, stopped by the ranch on Tuesday afternoon with a loose horseshoe that needed looking at and mentioned very casually that he'd seen Voss riding toward the county seat road that morning with two of his men. Ed said it the way people in Red Hollow said things they wanted you to know without appearing to be the one telling you, sideways, attached to something else, like an afterthought. Grant thanked him for the shoe and said nothing else until Ed was back down the road. Then he went inside and told Evelyn. She was at the table with Arthur Haynes's papers spread out next to a list she'd been building for 3 days. Names, dates, parcel numbers, the slow accumulation of a pattern that was starting to look less like coincidence and more like architecture. She looked up when he came in, read his face, and said, "How long ago?" "This morning, Ed thinks. Early." She nodded and looked back at the papers. "He'll try to pull the filing or delay it. He'll have someone at the county office who can slow things down." She tapped her pen against the notebook. "Did you keep a copy of everything?" "Like you told me." "And the original lease is where?" "Inside cover of the ledger, like you told me." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he was beginning to recognize. Not approval exactly, more like the recalibration of someone adjusting their estimate. She did it occasionally when he did something that didn't fit whatever picture she'd built of him. He found he didn't hate it. "Good," she said. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He looked at the list. There were 11 names on it now, each one a ranch family. 3 of the names had a small notation beside them. Confirmed loss. Sold to Voss. 2 more had question marks. The others were still being traced. "Any of these people still in the area?" he said. 4 of them. The others moved on. Kansas, Oregon, 1 as far as California. She ran her finger down the list. The 4 who stayed are within a day's ride. Haynes is one. There's a widow named Clara Pruitt up past Sutter Creek. A man named Del Fogarty who runs a small operation now on leased land. Used to own 300 acres. And a family called the Birches who are sharecropping for Voss himself, which I think is not a coincidence. Grant looked at the last name. Birches are sharecropping for Voss. On what used to be their own land, yes. He sat with that for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up again, pushing a dry smell across from the south pasture. The particular smell of late summer grass going brittle at the roots. Another few weeks and they'd be into the shoulder season. The hard work of preparing for what Montana did to ranches in winter. "He won't come at us directly," Grant said. He wasn't asking. He'd been thinking about Conrad Voss for 4 days now, trying to see the man clearly in a way he'd never bothered to before. That's not how he works. He'll use something else. Someone else. "He already has," Evelyn said. Grant looked up. She reached into the stack of papers and pulled out a folded note. "Clara Addison left this at the fence gate this morning before you were up. She didn't want to knock." She slid it across the table. The note was short. Clara Addison's handwriting was cramped and slanted, the kind of handwriting that came from a woman who'd taught herself to write without much help and had been writing fast ever since. It said, "Word around town that the cross woman came with a plan. People are saying she's working with Eastern land speculators, and Grant Mercer is too fool in love to see it. This is coming from somewhere deliberate. Thought you should know. C.A." Grant read it twice. He set it down on the table. "Too fool in love," he said. "I noticed that part too." Evelyn's voice was dry. "The point is the source. Clara doesn't say where she heard it, but Clara doesn't miss things. If it's moving through town that fast, someone seeded it somewhere people talk." She folded the note again. "Probably the saloon, probably last night. Someone who works for Voss, or someone who owes him a favor, which in this town is a longer list." She looked at the papers in front of her. "This is the move I told you he'd make. He can't attack the documents directly. Not yet. Not without revealing that he knows what the documents say, which reveals that he's been watching your property. So he attacks me. He makes people question why I'm here and what I want." She paused. "Once the town believes I'm some kind of Eastern schemer who's using you, anything I produce can be dismissed as manufactured, and you become the fool who got taken in by a pretty face." She said it without self-consciousness, the way she said most things, as an assessment, not a complaint. "That's not going to work," Grant said. She looked at him. "You'd be surprised how well it can work. You humiliated me on the street in front of half the town. People are already trying to figure out why I'm still here. The story that I'm manipulating you fits the gap." "I know." He said it flatly. He knew he'd handed Voss that gap himself, on the day Evelyn arrived. He'd been living with that particular awareness for days now. But knowing it and stopping it are different things. What do we do? Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She looked at the list of names. We keep building the record, she said, quietly, as long as we can. And we start talking to the people on this list. She looked up. Not asking them to do anything yet, just letting them know what we found. Letting them know they're not alone in it. She paused. Some of them won't want to talk. Some of them will be afraid. That's all right. We just need a few who are willing to say, eventually, that they recognize the pattern. Del Fogarty, Grant said. He'd known Del Fogarty most of his life. They'd been in school together for a year or two, back when both their fathers were still building. Del was the kind of man who went quiet when he was angry, which meant he'd been quiet for a long time. Del Fogarty will talk. Can you reach him without it looking like a meeting? Grant thought about it. He comes into town Thursdays for feed. I can happen to be at the grain store. The corner of her mouth moved. All right. He looked at the note from Clara Addison, still sitting on the table between them. He thought about the word deliberate. Clara had used it carefully, which meant she'd meant it carefully. Clara's on our side, he said. Clara's watching, Evelyn said, which is not quite the same thing, but it might be enough. She went back to her papers. Grant looked at her for a moment. The ink stain that had moved from her left index finger to her left wrist at some point. The way she held her pen at a slightly odd angle that suggested she'd taught herself and never corrected it. The small vertical line that appeared between her brows when she was working through something difficult. He looked away and went to put more wood on the stove. He didn't ask himself why he'd cataloged those things. He already knew, and knowing it was complicated enough without turning it over and examining it. Thursday came. Grant went to the grain store at the time he knew Del Fogarty came in, and Del was there loading sacks into the back of a wagon that had more repairs on it than original parts. He was a lean, weathered man, 50 or thereabouts, with the kind of face that had started hard and gotten harder. He looked up when Grant approached and didn't say anything, just watched him come. Del, Grant said. Grant. Del hefted another sack. Here you've got a woman at the ranch. I do. Town's talking about her. Town talks about everything. Del set the sack down in the wagon and straightened up, his hand at the small of his back for a moment. The gesture of a man who'd been loading and unloading things for 30 years more than his body appreciated. What do you want, Grant? Grant looked at the street. Nobody immediately close. Tom Briggs was down at the far end, and Pete Calloway was somewhere behind them in the store. The boundary on your old place, he said quietly. The north line. When they surveyed it during the dispute, did the numbers match your father's original filing? Del Fogarty went very still. It was the stillness of a man who's been waiting for a particular question for years and is now trying to decide whether to trust the person asking it. Why? He said. Because I think the survey was wrong, on purpose. The stillness held for another moment. Then Del Fogarty picked up the next sack, but slower this time, and his voice when he spoke was very even. My father filed in 1869. The numbers were clear. When Voss's lawyer presented the survey in the dispute, the north boundary had moved 60 rods south. He set the sack down. My lawyer said it was within the margin of correction, said the original filing might have been imprecise. He looked at Grant. My father was a precise man who surveyed it in the dispute. Man named Aldous Pratt. Grant held Del's gaze. Del Fogarty looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in his face. Not hope, not exactly, but the first crack in something that had been sealed shut a long time. What are you doing, Grant? Trying to fix it, Grant said. Not just mine. All of it. Del looked away. He looked at the wagon, at the sacks of feed that represented a season of work on land that had belonged to his family and now belonged to the man who'd taken it. He was quiet for long enough that Grant thought he might not say anything else. Then Del said, You need me to sign something? Not yet. Maybe eventually. Right now, I just need to know you'd be willing. Del picked up the last sack. You come to me when you need the signature, he said. I'll be there. He dropped the sack into the wagon. Tell your woman she's onto something real. Grant walked back to the ranch and told Evelyn. She added Del Fogarty's name to the list with a small star next to it. The trouble with keeping something quiet is that it requires everyone involved to be quiet, and not everyone is suited to it by nature. Robbie Ferris, the deputy clerk in the county land office, was an honest and well-meaning young man who was not suited to it at all. He mentioned to his cousin that he'd helped a woman look at some interesting survey records. His cousin mentioned it at dinner. By the following Tuesday, there was a version of the story circulating in the county seat that was wrong in almost every particular, but right in the one that mattered. Someone was looking at Aldous Pratt's old surveys. Word reached Red Hollow on Wednesday through the particular channel of the regional mail rider, who was more efficient at spreading news than letters. By Wednesday afternoon, Dorothy Hines had heard it. By Wednesday evening, it had reached the saloon. By Thursday morning, Evelyn found a dead crow on the front step of the ranch house. She stood in the doorway and looked at it for a moment. Then she went back inside, put on her boots, and carried it around to the far side of the barn. She didn't mention it to Grant. He found out anyway. She hadn't considered that he'd noticed the disturbed dust near the door. The way a man who's walked the same steps for 20 years notices when something's different. He came in from the morning feed, looked at the ground by the step, and said, "What was there?" She told him. His face did something she couldn't entirely read. Not quite anger, more like the cold settling of a man making up his mind about something. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "Children's prank," she said, "or someone trying to frighten me." "Which do you think?" "Someone trying to frighten me." He nodded. He didn't say "I'll handle it" or anything like that, which she noted. He just nodded and went to wash up. That same day, he drove her into town himself and walked beside her down the main street, past the post office and the dry goods and the barber shop, in a way that required no particular explanation and made every explanation unnecessary. He walked beside her like it was where he'd always planned to walk, which made it very difficult for anyone watching to tell the story of a fool getting taken in, because whatever Grant Mercer looked like, he did not look like a fool. Dorothy Hines watched from the post office window. Pete Calloway found somewhere else to be. Clara Addison, passing them outside the general store, gave Evelyn a small nod that contained more information than a paragraph. They went to the land office to check on the renewal filing. It had been slowed, as Evelyn had predicted, by a request for additional documentation. She spent 45 minutes in the office working through exactly which additional documentation was required, citing section numbers from county code that she apparently had memorized, while the clerk on duty became progressively more uncomfortable in the way of a man who has been given instructions to obstruct something and is discovering that the person on the other side is better at paperwork than he is. Grant sat in a chair in the corner and said nothing. He didn't need to. They got the filing confirmed. The clerk stamped it with the expression of a man who'd been outmaneuvered and knew it. Walking out, Grant said, "Where'd you learn county code?" "Ohio," she said. "Missouri. It varies by state, but the structure is similar." "You memorized it." "The relevant sections." She tucked the copy of the filing into her satchel. "You memorize the fence line on your property, don't you? Every post, every weak point?" "Yeah." "Same principle." She glanced at him sideways. "Different fence." He almost smiled. She wasn't sure she'd seen him almost smile before. It was different from his regular expression, in a way she found she wanted to look at longer, which was information she filed away and did not examine further. Done. The widow Clara Pruitt lived up past Sutter Creek in a small house that had been built for two people and now held one, with all the particular loneliness that kind of space creates. She was a small woman, 70 if she was a day, with white hair and hands that had done hard work long enough to forget what easy work felt like. She made them coffee they hadn't asked for and set out a tin of shortbread and watched Evelyn with sharp brown eyes that had clearly been deciding things about people for 7 decades. "You're the mail order woman," she said to Evelyn. "Yes, ma'am." "He turned you down on the street." She looked at Grant. "He did," Evelyn said, "and you stayed." "I did." Clara Pruitt looked at her for a long moment. "My husband was the same kind of stubborn," she said. "Drove me half crazy for 30 years. She picked up her coffee. "What do you want from me?" Evelyn explained. Not everything. She was careful about what she shared and with whom, but enough. The surveys. The pattern. Aldous Pratt. What had happened to Clara's own property 6 years ago, when the water dispute with Voss had somehow turned into a full boundary challenge that Clara hadn't had the money to fight alone. Clara listened without interrupting. She had the listening quality of someone who'd learned the hard way that speaking too soon cost you things you couldn't get back. When Evelyn finished, Clara was quiet for a moment. "I always knew," she said finally. "I knew something was wrong with those numbers. My husband filed everything correct every year. Then he died, and suddenly the numbers were different." She looked at her coffee cup. "My son said to let it go, said fighting Voss was a way to lose everything faster." She paused. Maybe he was right. "He wasn't wrong about the risk," Evelyn said carefully. "We're not going to pretend there's no risk." "No, I imagine you can't pretend that." Clara looked at her. "You've got a way of saying things straight. I appreciate that more than you might think." She set down her cup. "What do you need from me?" "Right now, nothing. Eventually, possibly a statement. What you remember about the original filing, your husband's records, if you still have them, what the survey showed versus what was filed." "I have the records," Clara said. Came out with a certain quiet emphasis, the way a person says something they've been holding on to without knowing why. "I kept everything. My son said to burn it all and stop making myself crazy. I kept it anyway." She looked at the corner of the room where an old trunk sat against the wall. "Always thought someday someone would need to see it." Evelyn looked at the trunk. "May I?" Clara nodded. What Evelyn found in that trunk took 2 hours to sort through on Clara Pruitt's kitchen table, and by the end of it, she had documented evidence of a survey discrepancy that was, if anything, more clearly fraudulent than Grant's. Clara's husband had filed precise records. A meticulous man, clearly. The kind of man who understood that paper was the only thing standing between him and someone else's claim on what he'd built. The discrepancy between his original survey and the amended one filed by Aldous Pratt was not 40 rods. It was closer to 80. Grant drove them home in the dark, and Evelyn sat beside him on the wagon seat with the carefully copied documents in her satchel and didn't say much. He didn't either. The night was clear and cold, the stars very present the way they got in Montana when the air had dried out, and the road ran through grass that was silver in the darkness. "She kept it," Grant said eventually. "All those years." "Some people know," Evelyn said. "They just don't have anyone to tell it to who can do something with it." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you came out here? To find this?" "I came out here because I answered your letter." She looked at the road ahead. "But finding this was... it fits." She paused. "Some things fit." He didn't ask what she meant. She thought perhaps he understood it, or something close to it. They got back to the ranch after 9. She went to her room and sat at the small table and wrote up the summary of Clara Pruitt's records while everything was still precise in her memory, because precision was the point, because the whole thing lived or died on precision. She wrote until her hand cramped, and then she kept writing. In the kitchen, she could hear Grant moving around, the sound of him banking the fire for the night, the particular sequence of sounds that had become familiar enough in 2 weeks that she knew what each one was. The creak of the third floorboard, the scrape of the damper on the stove. She'd spent a long time learning not to rely on the sounds of other people. It was safer. You didn't lose things that way. She kept writing. Outside, the Montana night pressed against the window glass, cold and enormous and entirely indifferent to the small lamp burning on the table where a woman worked to make sure the truth had somewhere to land when the time came to use it. She wasn't done. She wasn't close to done. Conrad Voss had been building this thing for the better part of a decade, and she'd been at it 2 weeks, and the imbalance of that was something she was going to have to hold very carefully in her mind going forward. But she had Clara Pruitt's trunk. She had Del Fogarty's word. She had Arthur Haynes. She had a man who walked beside her down a main street and made it mean something without saying a word. The list had 11 names on it. 4 of them had stars now. She turned to a fresh page and wrote the 5th name at the top, Birch family, currently sharecropping for Voss on their own former land. She underlined it. She wrote a single question next to it. What do they know that they haven't said yet? That was what scared her most, if she was honest. Not the crow on the step, not the rumor Conrad had seeded through town. What scared her was the people who knew things and had been frightened into silence for long enough that the silence had become its own kind of survival. Getting those people to speak was going to be harder than finding the records. Records didn't have anything to lose. People did. She sat with that for a while, listening to the quiet of the house. And then she put down her pen and rubbed her hand and looked at the window where the darkness had her own reflection in it, faint and uncertain. She looked like someone who was in deeper than she'd planned. She picked the pen back up. The Birch family lived on the eastern edge of what had once been their own land, in a house that Conrad Voss had let them stay in after he acquired the property, a gesture that looked like mercy from a distance and felt, up close, like a collar. Evelyn had thought about how to approach them for 4 days before she said anything to Grant about it. She'd turned it over at night when she couldn't sleep, the way she turned over most problems, methodically, from different angles, looking for the approach that caused the least damage to the thing she was trying to reach. The Birch family had been sharecropping Voss's land for 3 years. That meant 3 years of being dependent on a man who had taken everything from them. You didn't walk up to people in that position and ask them to help you fight the man who controlled their livelihood. Not directly. She told Grant on a Sunday morning when they were both in the yard, him repairing the gate latch she'd mentioned 3 times and finally stopped mentioning, her going through the chicken situation, which had devolved in ways she didn't entirely understand. "I want to ride out to the Birch place," she said. "Not about the records. Not yet. Just to talk." He looked up from the gate. "Talk about what?" "About whether their daughter's still looking for work." She met his look. Clara Addison mentioned the girl, Nora Birch, 19, has been trying to find something in town, something away from the farm. She paused. "I thought we might be able to use a hand around here for the season." Grant considered this. He was getting better at following her reasoning without needing the full map, she'd noticed. He turned back to the gate latch. "And it gives you a reason to be at their place that doesn't look like what it is. It gives us a reason. And if Nora takes the work, it gives her a way out of a situation she can't get out of on her own." He was quiet for a moment. "What if they don't want anything to do with it?" "Then we respect that and we find another way." She looked at the chickens, who were doing something irrational in the far corner of the coop. "But I think they know things, Grant. I think they've been living on top of things they know and have nowhere to put." He set down the latch and looked at her properly. "You think Voss lets them stay in that house because it's convenient to have them close?" She'd thought the same thing and hadn't said it yet. "I think a man like Voss prefers his problems where he can see them." Grant picked the latch back up. "We'll go Tuesday," he said. "I've got a legitimate reason to be out that way. Fence inspection on the eastern boundary." A pause. "Which I've been meaning to do anyway." "Has that been true this whole time, or did you just decide it?" The corner of his mouth moved. "Both." She went back to the chickens. "Okay." The Birch farm was a study in what happened to land when the people working it had no stake in what they were building. The fields were tended adequately. Voss would require that much. But there was nothing beyond adequate. No improvements, no small adjustments that spoke of someone thinking about next year and the year after. The farmhouse itself had a repaired window on the south side done in a way that worked but had no particular care in it, and the kitchen garden was practical without being anything more. A woman came to the door before they'd fully tied the horses. She was maybe 50, with gray in her hair and a face that had made a permanent peace with wariness. She looked at Grant first, recognizing him, and then at Evelyn with the measured look of a woman who had learned to assess strangers quickly. "Mrs. Birch," Grant said. "Sorry to come without notice. I was out on the East Line and thought I'd stop." He nodded toward Evelyn. "This is Evelyn Cross, staying at my place." "I know who she is," the woman said. Not unkindly, just a statement. "Come in if you want coffee." Her name was Ruth Birch, and she made coffee the way Grant did, strong enough to make a point, and she set it on the table without ceremony and sat across from them with the posture of someone who had decided to hear them out and reserved the right to end the conversation at any moment. Her husband, Thomas Birch, came in from the back of the house partway through the coffee. He was a broad man, not tall, with heavy hands and the particular quiet of someone who'd been angry for a very long time and had stopped showing it on the surface because showing it changed nothing. He sat down next to his wife and looked at Grant with an expression that was almost entirely neutral. "Thomas," Grant said. "Grant." He looked at Evelyn. "You're the one who's been in the land office." There was no point in softening it. "Yes," Evelyn said, "looking at Pratt's surveys." "Among other things." Thomas Birch wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He looked at the table. "Our daughter's not here," he said. "She's in town today." "I was going to ask about her, actually," Evelyn said. "Clara Addison mentioned she might be looking for work outside the farm." We could use someone at the Mercer place for the season. General ranch work, help with the house. It's honest pay, not tied to anyone's good opinion. Ruth Birch's expression shifted in a way that told Evelyn she'd said the right thing with those last 4 words, not tied to anyone's good opinion. Ruth understood exactly what that meant. Thomas looked at his wife. Some conversation passed between them in the way of people who've been married long enough to do that. She's been wanting out of here, Ruth said finally. We won't stop her if she chooses it. Then it's her choice to make, Evelyn said. I just wanted you to know the offer was there. The room was quiet. Outside, a horse shifted in the small paddock. Ruth refilled their cups without being asked. The north boundary, Thomas Birch said. He set it to his coffee cup. When Pratt came out for the survey, he spent 2 days. My father's original filing had us running to the creek. After Pratt, we ran 50 rods short of it. He looked up. His eyes were the kind that had done a lot of looking at things that didn't have good answers. My father's numbers were right. I know they were right because my father surveyed it himself, and my father was a man who didn't get numbers wrong. Evelyn kept her voice steady. Do you have his records? Thomas looked at his wife again. Ruth got up from the table and went to the back of the house. She came back with a tin box that had been painted blue a long time ago. The paint now cracked and faded. She set it on the table between them. We've had this for 22 years, she said. Thought about giving it to a lawyer once. Lawyer said it wasn't enough on its own. She put her hand on the lid. Is it enough now? Evelyn opened the box. She spent 10 minutes going through it carefully while the Birches watched her and Grant watched the Birches. Then she looked up. It's enough, she said. Not on its own, but with the others. Yes, it's enough. Thomas Birch made a sound that wasn't quite anything. Not relief, not satisfaction, too complicated for either of those words. It was the sound of a man who has been carrying a weight so long he's forgotten what it felt like to put it down, just briefly imagining what that might feel like. You're going to fight him, he said. It wasn't entirely a question. We are, Grant said. He'd been quiet through most of it, but his voice when he spoke was the kind of quiet that had weight in it. Thomas looked at him. He'll come after everything you have. He's already started, Grant said. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once, the slow nod of a man making a decision he'd been working toward without knowing it. You copy what you need from that box, he said to Evelyn. Take your time. Well, Nora Birch arrived at the Mercer Ranch the following Friday in a wagon her father drove and then turned around without getting down from the seat. She was 19, with her mother's wariness and something else beneath it that was younger and angrier and hadn't made its peace yet with how things were. She looked around the ranch yard with frank assessment, no pretending she wasn't evaluating it, and said to Evelyn, Clara Addison says you're the smartest woman she's met in 10 years. Clara's generous, Evelyn said. Clara's not generous, she's precise. Nora looked at her directly. I'm not here just to muck stalls. I know that, Evelyn said. Nora studied her. What do you know about my family's land? Enough, and I'm learning more. The girl nodded, satisfied, or as close as she got to it. She went and found the barn and started making herself useful with the methodical focus of someone who'd been working since she was old enough to hold a tool, which told Evelyn everything she needed to know about what her life on the Birch farm had actually looked like. Having Nora at the ranch changed the texture of the days in ways Evelyn hadn't fully anticipated. She was sharp and practical and had a way of noticing things, a loose board here, a drainage issue there, that reminded Evelyn, startlingly, of herself. She also had a quick, sardonic humor that surfaced at unexpected moments and made Grant look momentarily puzzled before he caught it, which was the closest thing to entertainment the situation had produced. She also, it turned out, knew things. Not records, not documents, but the accumulated knowledge of a 19-year-old who'd grown up on Voss's land watching his operation from close range, seeing which men he sent where and when and what happened after. She knew which of Voss's hired men was trustworthy and which weren't. She knew that Voss had a lawyer in Billings who came out twice a year and that the visits had been getting longer. She knew that Voss's wife, Marianne, hadn't come into town in over 3 months, which Nora said wasn't normal because Marianne Voss used to come for the Wednesday market fairly regularly. That last piece sat with Evelyn in a particular way she couldn't immediately articulate. She mentioned it to Grant that evening. Marianne Voss, she said. What do you know about her? He thought about it. Not much, quiet woman. She's been out here, 12 years, maybe 13. Came from somewhere back east. Conrad brought her back from a trip to Denver. He paused. She always seemed like she was somewhere slightly to the side of wherever she actually was, if that makes sense. It made sense to Evelyn in a way she didn't say out loud. She hasn't been to town in 3 months, Evelyn said. That's not necessarily... It might not be anything, she agreed, but Nora says it isn't her habit. She looked at the notes on the table. Voss is escalating. The rumor campaign didn't stop us. The filing delay didn't stop us. A crow on the front step didn't stop us. She tapped her pen. A man who's been methodical for 10 years doesn't change patterns without a reason. Something's changing. Grant leaned against the counter and looked at her. What do you think it is? I think he's worried. She looked up, which means he knows we have more than he expected, which means someone told him. She let that sit for a moment. Grant's expression went careful. Who knew what we had? Haynes, Del Fogarty, the Birches, Clara Pruitt. Clara Addison knows pieces, but not the whole. She paused. Robbie Ferris knows we've been in the land office. Robbie Ferris isn't... No, I don't think it's Robbie. I think Robbie talks too much without meaning harm. She frowned. I think someone saw us at the Birch Farm Tuesday and put things together. Or someone in the county clerk's office said more than they should have. She set the pen down. It doesn't change what we do. We keep building, but we move faster now. Grant nodded. How fast? Fast enough that we're ready before he makes his real move. She looked at him. Because whatever he's planning next, it's not going to be a crow on a front step. She was right about that. She just didn't know from which direction it would come. Boto. It came from the direction she'd thought about but hadn't fully prepared for, which was herself. 10 days after the visit to the Birch Farm, a man arrived in Red Hollow from Billings. His name was James Wharton, and he had an office on the second floor of a building near the Land Records Bureau, and he had been retained, he announced at the county seat, to investigate potential fraud in a land transaction involving Evelyn Cross, formerly of St. Louis, Missouri. The specific allegation, which made its way to Red Hollow within 48 hours, because that was how fast things moved, was that Evelyn Cross had previously been involved in a fraudulent property scheme in St. Louis, in which she had inserted herself into a land dispute to extract money from both parties before disappearing. It was detailed enough to sound credible. It named a firm, a date, a specific property address. It did not have Voss's name anywhere near it, but it had Voss's patience and Voss's method, small, careful, filed through proper channels. Grant heard it from Ede Chambers, who told him the way he told everything, sideways and attached to something else. He came back to the ranch and stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "There's an investigator from Billings. He's saying you were involved in a fraud scheme in St. Louis." Evelyn was at the table. She stopped writing. She held very still for a moment in the way she did when she was processing something she hadn't anticipated. Then she said, "Sit down." He sat. "The firm they're naming," she said. "Is it Harwick and Lowell?" He frowned. Ed didn't say. "If it's Harwick and Lowell, it's fabricated from something real. I worked for a firm in St. Louis, Davenport Title, not Harwick, and there was a dispute that became complicated, but the outcome was documented and I was not implicated." She said it steadily. "I have records, not with me, but I can get them." "How long will that take?" "A week if the mail is direct, maybe 10 days. She looked at the table. "That's 10 days for this story to settle into people's minds as something that might be true." Grant looked at her. He had learned her face by now, the difference between her working face and her thinking face, and the very rare face she made when something hit a nerve she hadn't fully defended. This last one had the quality of something that had been tried before. "This happened to you before," he said. Not a question. She was quiet for a moment. "Not exactly this, but a version of it. In Ohio, after my father's farm. When I started asking questions, the man we were asking questions about found things about my father to put in front of people. Small things, but things. Made my father look like someone who couldn't be trusted." Her voice was even and entirely controlled in the way it got when the subject cost her something. Made it easier to dismiss what we were saying. "Same play," Grant said. "Same play. Different state." She looked at her hands on the table. The question is whether we stop or whether we give them less time than they're counting on. What does less time look like? She looked up at him. It looks like doing what I said we should do. Going public before he's ready for us to. Not waiting for a perfect moment, because there won't be one. Taking what we have to someone who can hear it officially and putting it on record before this story about me gets wide enough that nobody can hear anything else. He was quiet for a moment. We don't have everything yet. We have enough to start. Not enough to finish, maybe, but enough to start. She looked at him steadily. The Birch records, Claire Pruitt's trunk, Del Fogarty's testimony, Arthur Haynes, your boundary documentation, and the water rights. She paused. There's a state land commissioner who oversees county records disputes. His name is Martin Aldred. He's out of Helena. I've been thinking about him for 2 weeks. You've been thinking about Aldred for 2 weeks, and you're just telling me now? I was hoping we'd have more before we needed him. She held his gaze. We don't have time to wait for more. Grant sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, the familiar crack in the plaster above the table that he'd been meaning to fix since his father was alive. Then he looked at her. What do you need from me? I need you to write to Aldred tomorrow, she said. I'll draft the letter tonight. And I need you to go to Del Fogarty and Arthur Haynes and the Birches and tell them it's time to be ready. Not to do anything yet, just to be ready. And you? I'm going to go see Marianne Voss, she said. The kitchen went very quiet. Evelyn, I know. She picked up her pen. I know what I'm saying. If Conrad finds out, Conrad is going to do something worse than a fabricated fraud allegation if we give him enough time. We don't have enough time. She looked at the notes in front of her, the weeks of careful accumulation that had brought them here. Marianne hasn't been to town in 3 months. Nora says that isn't normal. A woman who's been living with what her husband has done for 12 years. She stopped, reorganized. She might know where the proof is that we can't find in county records. The money that changed hands, the communications with Pratt, the arrangements with the county officials. She looked at him. The evidence that makes the difference between something that can be investigated and something that can't be walked back from. Grant's jaw was tight. And if she's not willing, if she's too afraid, then we know, and we work with what we have. She looked at him. But I think she's been waiting for someone to come to her for a long time. The same way Claire Pruitt kept that trunk for 20 years and the Birches kept their tin box. People who know things tend to keep them. He was quiet for a long time. The fire in the stove had burned down to a low, steady heat. Outside, the wind had picked up off the north ridge, the first real edge of autumn in it. The kind of cold that reminded you winter was not a metaphor in Montana. I don't like it, he said finally. I know. You'd be riding onto his property. I'd be calling on his wife, in daylight, in plain sight of anyone who cared to look. That hasn't stopped him before. She looked at him across the table, and in the low light she looked, not fearless, which would have been something he could file away and not worry about. She looked like someone who was afraid of the right things and had decided to go anyway, which was the harder thing to watch. Grant, she said, we didn't start this to back down when it got hard. He looked at her for a long moment. His jaw was still tight. He was going to say something else. She could see it forming. And then he didn't. He stood up and went to the stove and put more wood on it, which she had learned was the thing he did when he had decided something he didn't entirely like deciding. You go in the morning, he said, with his back to her. I'll come with you as far as the road. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. He turned around. His face was the closed, forward-looking face she'd first seen on the street in Red Hollow, the one that didn't invite argument. I'll come as far as the road. She looked at him. Something moved in her chest that she identified and set aside for the same reason she set aside most things that moved in her chest regarding Grant Mercer, because there was too much at stake to be distracted by it, and because she had spent a long time learning not to need things that could be taken from her. All right, she said, as far as the road. She went back to the letter for Martin Aldred and wrote until the lamp oil was almost gone. When she finally stopped, the house was fully dark and quiet, and Grant's light under the kitchen door had been out for a long time. She sat in the dark for a moment and thought about Marianne Voss, who hadn't come to town in 3 months. She thought about what it meant to live inside a secret that wasn't yours, to be the person adjacent to a wrong that you hadn't committed and couldn't stop and had to be around every day. She thought about her father, who'd been the same way at the end, adjacent to a wrong, knowing things he couldn't make anyone hear. She picked up the copy of the Birch records from the table and held them for a moment in the dark, the paper a solid, real weight in her hands. Then she put them down, braided her hair, and went to sleep. In the morning, they would start the part that couldn't be undone. The Voss property sat 3 miles south of Red Hollow, on land that had been accumulating for a decade, piece by piece, boundary by boundary, the way a flood takes ground, not all at once but steadily, until you look up one day and can't remember where the original shoreline was. The main house was large by valley standards, 2 stories with a covered porch running the full length of the front, built from timber that had been properly milled and fitted in a way that announced money without quite shouting it. The kind of house that said, "I have been here a long time and I intend to stay." Grant rode with Evelyn as far as the turnoff, the way he'd said he would. He stopped his horse at the fence post that marked the boundary of Voss land and looked at the house visible in the middle distance. And then he looked at her. "You see anyone? You turn around," he said. "I will. I mean it. If Conrad is there, then I'm a neighbor making a call on a woman I haven't properly introduced myself to." She looked at him steadily. "It's a reasonable thing to do. It's a reasonable story. Grant?" She held his gaze. "I've been doing this longer than 2 weeks." He looked at the house. His jaw was doing the thing it did. Then he said, "I'll be at the fence line on the east pasture, 2 hours." She nodded and turned her horse down the Voss road. She'd thought about Marianne Voss every night for a week. She'd asked Nora carefully about her, what she was like, how she moved through her days. Nora had grown up on the edge of the Voss property and had observations accumulated over years without ever being asked for them. Marianne Voss, Nora said, was a woman who did things quietly. She kept a kitchen garden. She read. She used to come into town for the Wednesday market and sometimes stayed to have coffee with Clara Addison, who had once said in Nora's hearing that Marianne Voss was the kind of woman who'd taken a wrong turn somewhere and knew it and had gotten too far down the road to see how to get back. She had no children. Nora didn't know why. She'd been in the valley 13 years and had somehow managed to be present without being known, which Evelyn recognized as a particular skill that certain women develop when they need it. The woman who answered the door was not what Evelyn had expected, which was becoming a pattern in Red Hollow. Marianne Voss was perhaps 40, with fair hair going to silver at the temples, and the kind of face that had been pretty in a way that time had not so much erased as clarified. The softness worn away, the bone structure made more visible. She had careful eyes, gray-blue, that took Evelyn in with one sweep and gave nothing back immediately. "Mrs. Voss," Evelyn said. "I'm Evelyn Cross. I'm staying at the Mercer Ranch. I should have called before now and I didn't, which I'm sorry for. I wanted to introduce myself." Marianne looked at her for a long moment. She looked at the road behind her, which was empty. She looked at Evelyn again. "My husband isn't here," she said. "He's at the county seat." "I know," Evelyn said, which was true. She'd confirmed it through Ed Chambers the previous evening. Something shifted in Marianne's expression. Not warmth, not yet, but the particular quality of a person recalibrating what they're dealing with. "Come in," she said. The inside of the Voss house was neat in the specific way of spaces where someone has imposed order as a form of control over something else. Every surface was in its place. The sitting room had good furniture, better than most in the valley, and on the side table there was a stack of books that were actually worn from reading, which told Evelyn more about Marianne Voss than the furniture did. She made tea, not coffee. Tea, which meant she'd kept some habits from wherever she'd come from. She set it on the table between them and sat down across from Evelyn with the posture of a woman who had spent a long time in rooms where she needed to be careful, and who had gotten so good at being careful that she did it now, even when she didn't know if she needed to. "I've heard about you, bitch," Marianne said. She said it without accusation, almost neutrally. "I imagine you have. Conrad says you're trouble. I think that depends on who you're asking." Evelyn kept her voice even. "I think if you asked Arthur Haynes, he'd say I'm something else." Marianne's teacup stopped halfway to her mouth, just for a second. Then she set it down. "You know about Haynes," she said. "I know about several people." Evelyn looked at her. "I know about the Birches, Clara Pruitt, Del Fogarty. I know about Aldous Pratt and what his surveys produced." She kept her voice quiet, even, the same register she used when she wanted the facts to carry the weight instead of her tone. I know this has been going on for a long time, and I know it was deliberate, and I know your husband is at the center of it. The room was very quiet. A clock on the mantel ticked. Marianne looked at her hands around the teacup. She was quiet for long enough that Evelyn thought she might get up and ask her to leave. Then she said, "How much can you prove?" "Enough to open a formal investigation by the state land commissioner. Enough that it becomes very difficult to make go away." She paused. "Not enough to make it stick completely. Not yet." Marianne looked up. "What would make it stick completely?" Evelyn looked at her directly. "Evidence of the arrangements, the payments to Pratt, communications with county officials, the paper trail that shows the fraud was coordinated, not just a series of clerical errors." She kept looking at her. "The kind of records a man like Conrad Voss would keep because he is meticulous and because he would want proof that the people he paid actually did what he paid them for." The clock ticked. Somewhere at the back of the house, a door moved in the wind. Marianne set her teacup down very carefully, as if the precision of the gesture helped her think. "I have lived in this house for 13 years, she said. Her voice was completely flat. "I came from Denver. I thought—" She stopped. "What I thought doesn't matter. What matters is that by the time I understood what he was, I was here, and being here it had certain terms." She looked at the window. "He keeps records. You're right about that. He's careful in the way that careful men are careful. He keeps everything because he believes that having evidence of what other people did for him protects him if they ever decide to stop staying quiet." Evelyn's heartbeat was steady. She kept it steady deliberately. "Where?" "His office. The room at the back of the house, off the hall. He keeps the important documents in a locked box in the bottom drawer of the desk." Marianne looked back at her. "The key is on a chain he wears. I don't have access to the key." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "But you've seen the box." "I've seen what goes into it." A pause. "He doesn't always remember I'm in the room." "What did you see go into it?" Marianne was quiet for a long time, long enough that Evelyn began to understand the weight of what she was asking. Not just information, but the dismantling of a life that had been built on not saying what she knew, on being present without being known, on survival terms that required silence as payment. "Letters," Marianne said finally, "from Pratt, after each survey amendment, brief but specific about what had been done and what he expected in return." She looked at her hands. "Receipts. I saw him write receipts and file them. He told me once, when he'd had too much whiskey, that the receipts were his insurance, that if anyone ever came after him, he'd have proof that other men were as guilty as he was." She looked up. "He said it like it was clever." "It is clever," Evelyn said. "It's also what's going to be used against him, if someone can get into the box." Marianne looked at her steadily. "Which requires the key, which he carries." Evelyn thought for a moment. "Is there any time when he doesn't have it on him?" The answer came slowly. "When he bathes. He leaves the chain on the dresser." She said it with a flat precision that told Evelyn she'd noticed it for her own reasons once, long ago, and filed it away for a purpose she hadn't fully defined. "He'll be back tonight?" "By evening." Evelyn looked at her. She understood what she was asking. She understood the size of it. "Marianne," she said, and it was the first time she'd used the given name, and they both noticed it. "I'm not going to pretend this is simple. If he finds out before we have the records in front of the commissioner, you are in a very difficult position." "I've been in a very difficult position for 13 years, Marianne said. Came out with an edge, not at Evelyn, but at the years themselves. "I have been in a difficult position every day I have watched what he does to people in this valley, and said nothing because saying something had terms." She straightened in her chair. "I want to be clear about something. I'm not doing this because I have faith in the law or because I believe things work out the way they should. I've seen enough to know they don't always." She looked at Evelyn. "I'm doing this because I am very tired, and because you came here, which means someone finally can do something with what I know." Evelyn looked at her. She thought about Clara Pruitt and her blue tin trunk. She thought about the Birch's painted box. She thought about all the things people carry because they have nowhere to put them, and someone has to eventually come along and take the weight. "There's a hearing," Evelyn said. We're petitioning the state commissioner for a formal review. It will take time to arrange, and Conrad will know it's coming. He'll have time to prepare. She paused. We need the box before the hearing, not after. Marianne nodded slowly. She was already somewhere inside herself working through something. I'll need a few days, she said. We may not have a few days. The investigator Voss sent to Billings. I know about Wharton, Marianne said it with a tired precision. Conrad told me. He told me it was necessary. She looked at Evelyn. The story about St. Louis. Is it true? No. I didn't think it was. She stood up and went to the window. Outside, the Voss land spread in every direction. The land that had been accumulated piece by piece over a decade, all of it visible from this one house. He does this with women, she said. Makes up the professional kind of story. He did it to a man in Miles City who got too close to his cattle operation. He finds the right kind of damage and he applies it. She turned from the window. He found something real about you, didn't he? Something he could build a story on top of. Evelyn didn't answer immediately. Then she said, There was a complicated property dispute in St. Louis. I was on the right side of it. The documentation proving that is in Missouri and takes time to get. Time he's counting on. Yes. Marianne looked at her for a long moment. Then she crossed to the small writing desk in the corner of the sitting room. She opened the middle drawer and took out an envelope. She held it for a moment, looking at it. The gesture of someone who's made a decision and is taking the last second before the decision becomes irrevocable. She held out the envelope. This is a letter, she said. I wrote it 2 years ago. I never sent it. She kept her eyes on Evelyn's face. It describes what I saw go into that box over 11 years. Dates, descriptions of the documents. The conversation I overheard between Conrad and Pratt in the spring of 1889, where Pratt said the Fogarty survey was the cleanest one yet. She paused. It's not the box, but it corroborates the box. Evelyn took the envelope. She held it, feeling its weight. The years of careful watching compressed into paper. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet. Marianne sat back down. Come back in 3 days, come in the morning when Conrad goes to the South Fields. He goes every Wednesday to check on the irrigation work. Come to the back of the house, not the front. She looked at Evelyn with the particular directness of someone who has spent a long time being indirect and finds it a relief to stop. I'll have the box. Evelyn left the Voss house 20 minutes later and rode back to the fence line where Grant was waiting, and she could see from 50 yards out that he'd been watching the road the whole time. He looked at her face when she reached him and didn't say anything for a moment. Well, he said, she's going to help us. She tucked the envelope further into her satchel. She's been wanting to for a long time. Grant looked at the Voss house, still visible in the distance. His expression was unreadable in the way it got when he was working through something that involved more pieces than he'd expected. Voss finds out, he said, and she knows that. Evelyn met his eyes. She's decided, he nodded. They rode back toward the ranch in the morning air that had gone properly cold now. The autumn arriving in the valley with the matter-of-fact certainty of a season that doesn't need to announce itself. The grass was changing color at the edges, and the light was different in the way that September light in Montana was different, lower and more direct, like it was paying closer attention. Grant said, after a while, When did you write the letter to Aldred? Last night. It goes out today. She looked ahead at the road. He'll need 2 weeks minimum to arrange a formal hearing, probably 3. She paused. That's 3 weeks for Voss to find out what Marianne is doing. Can we do it faster? Not if we want it to hold. A rushed hearing is one he can challenge procedurally. We need it formal, documented, with proper notice and the right witnesses. Grant was quiet. She could see him calculating, the way she did it herself, timing, sequence, what had to happen in what order for the whole thing to hold together. The Billings investigator, he said, Wharton, if he files something before the hearing, it makes us look reactive. I know. She'd been thinking about Wharton for days. I'm writing to the title company in St. Louis directly. I need them to send confirmation of my record there by the fastest mail they have. She looked at him sideways. And I need you to do something that might be uncomfortable. What? I need you to go to Dorothy Hines. He made a face. Dorothy Hines. She reads every piece of mail in and out of this town. You know it, and I know it, and she knows that we know it. That's not a problem. It's a resource. She kept her voice even. If Dorothy Hines understands what Wharton is doing and understands what we're doing, then when my letter from the St. Louis firm arrives, it arrives correctly and promptly and without any detours. Grant was quiet for a moment. You want me to ask Dorothy Hines to protect our mail? I want you to make her feel like she's part of something important, which she is, because she will then act like she's part of something important, which is what we need. She looked at him. Can you do that? He considered. Dorothy's been wanting something on Conrad Voss since he tried to buy the post office building out from under her 6 years ago. I didn't know that. Nobody talks about it. She doesn't talk about it. He looked at the road. She'll do it. They got back to the ranch to find Nora Birch had reorganized the tool shed with a logic that Grant initially didn't understand and then saw the sense of, which he acknowledged by saying nothing about it, which Nora appeared to accept as sufficient. That evening, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table and spread out everything they had. All of it, in order. The boundary documents, Clara Pruitt's records, the Birch tin box papers she'd copied, Del Fogarty's account, Arthur Haynes's testimony, the Marianne Voss envelope, and her own documentation of the pattern across all of them. She looked at it spread across the table and thought about what was missing and what was present and what the shape of it was. Grant came and stood in the doorway and looked at the table. Is it enough? He said. With the box? Yes. Without it, she looked at the papers. Without it, we have a strong argument and no smoking gun. A good lawyer can create enough uncertainty to delay, to challenge, to drag it into hearings where the other families can't afford to wait. So we need the box. We need the box. He came and sat down across from her. He looked at the papers. Weeks of work, of early mornings and late nights, and 100 small conversations that had each cost somebody something. He picked up the copy of Clara Pruitt's records and looked at them, and she could see him thinking about Clara, about the trunk kept for 20 years, about the moment Clara had said, I always knew. 3 days, he said. 3 days. He set the papers down. He looked at her across the table. The lamp was between them, and it put warm light on his face in a way that made him look like someone different from the man who'd stood on a street in June and panicked at the sight of her. He didn't look like that man much anymore. She wasn't entirely sure when the change had happened. These things didn't have a specific moment, usually. They were more like the season changing. One day you looked up and the light was different, and you understood the summer was behind you. There's something I want to ask you, he said. She waited. The letter to Aldred. He looked at the papers. You wrote it asking for a formal hearing into the Mercer boundary dispute. He looked up. Did you write it for all of them? All the properties? She held his gaze. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. That changes the scope of the hearing. It's not just my ranch anymore. It never was just your ranch. She said it gently. It was always about all of them. I just needed your ranch to be the door in. He looked at her. Something moved in his face that she'd seen a few times before and never quite named. Something that was past respect and before whatever came after it. Living in the space where a person realizes they've been seen accurately by someone else and doesn't know whether to be relieved or exposed. You planned this from the start, he said. I saw the possibility from the start, she said. There's a difference. Is there? I planned to help you with your boundary dispute. What I saw the possibility of was something larger, if the evidence was there. She looked at him directly. The evidence was there, so I followed it. He sat with that. I would have liked to know, he said finally. Not accusatory, more like someone noting a thing for the record. I know. She looked down at the papers. I was afraid if you knew the full scope, you'd pull back, that you'd say it was too much, too risky. Would I have? She thought about it honestly. Maybe in the beginning, now. She looked up. Now I think you would have said the same thing Del Fogarty said. What did Del say? He said you come to me when you need the signature. She held his gaze. I think that's what you would have said. Grant was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the table. Then he said, For what it's worth, that is what I would have said. She let out a breath. Small, controlled, but he noticed it. She could tell by the slight shift in his expression, the awareness that she'd been more anxious about this than she'd shown, which seemed to surprise him even though it shouldn't have. Evelyn, he said, I know I gave you reason early on not to trust my judgment. I know that. He looked at her steadily. But I'm in this with you. All of it. Whatever the scope is. He paused. You can tell me things. She looked at him across the lamp and the papers and the weeks of accumulated work between them, and she thought about what it meant to trust someone with the full shape of something. Not just the part that was easy to explain, not just the safe version, but the whole complicated architecture of it. I know, she said. I'm working on it. He nodded. That was all. He didn't push it further, which was exactly right, which was the kind of thing she noticed about him now. The ways in which he got things right without knowing he was being observed getting them right. Outside, the Montana night had settled fully over the valley, cold and deep and very quiet. Inside, the lamp burned on the table between them, and the papers were spread out in their ordered rows, and somewhere 3 miles south, a woman who had been silent for 13 years was preparing to do the hardest thing she'd ever done. 3 days. Wednesday arrived with cloud cover and a wind off the north ridge that had real winter in it. Evelyn rode out alone, the way they'd agreed. Grant's presence at the Voss property would be noticed in a way that a single woman calling on the mistress of the house would not. She went to the back of the house as Marianne had instructed, tied her horse at the rear post, and knocked twice. Marianne opened the door almost immediately. Her face was composed, but her hands, Evelyn noticed, were not entirely steady. Come in, she said, quickly. Inside, on the kitchen table, sat a wooden box, dark-stained, about the size of a large book. It was open. The lock had been forced, not cleanly, with a bent piece of wire that had clearly taken considerable effort and left marks on the wood. The chain, Evelyn said. He leaves it on the dresser when he bathes. Marianne looked at the box. I've had 3 nights to think about how to do it. He's a heavy sleeper. I thought... She stopped. It doesn't matter how. I did it. Evelyn looked at the contents of the box. Letters, receipts, a ledger of a specific kind. Not an accounting ledger, but a record of arrangements, coded but not coded enough, in Conrad Voss's meticulous handwriting. She picked up the first letter. It was from Aldous Pratt, dated 1885, and it was specific in the way that men are specific when they believe the written word is safety rather than liability. It named the Fogarty property. It named the amount Pratt had received. It named the county clerk who had countersigned the amended filing. Evelyn's hands were steady. She made them stay steady. Is all of this from him? She said. His handwriting, his records. Everything in that box is in his hand or from someone writing to him. He received everything. He kept everything. Marianne's voice was flat with a decade of compressed feeling. He trusted his own system. He didn't think anyone would ever be inside his house going through his locked box. Evelyn began to copy. She had brought paper and 2 pens, and she worked methodically, prioritizing by importance. Pratt's letters first, then the receipts, then the ledger entries. Marianne sat at the far end of the table and watched with her hands folded, very still, the way a person sits when they've done something they can't undo and are waiting for the world to catch up with the decision. 1 hour and 40 minutes. That was how long it took. Evelyn's handwriting was fast and precise, and she wrote until her wrist ached and kept writing. When she finally set down the pen, she had 14 pages of copies covering the most critical documents. She looked at Marianne. The originals need to stay in the box. I know. If he suspects, and the box is empty, I'll put them back. Marianne looked at the box. He won't notice the lock until he goes to open it himself, and he doesn't open it unless he's worried. She paused. Right now he's not worried. He thinks the Wharton business has bought him time. It has. Some. Evelyn gathered her copied pages, keeping them in order. When the hearing is called, and it will be called, that's been set in motion, he will open the box. At that point, what's in the originals needs to match what we're presenting. It will. Marianne looked at her. What happens to me? It was the first time she'd asked that directly, and Evelyn understood the weight of it. She'd been waiting to ask it, managing without the answer, and now needed to know. I don't know exactly, Evelyn said. She'd decided not to give the easy answer because Marianne was not a woman you gave easy answers to. The law is complicated about spouses. There are arguments for protection and arguments against. I'm not a lawyer. She looked at her steadily. What I can tell you is that what you've done today, and the letter you gave me, that speaks for itself. A woman who had stayed silent and protected her husband would not have done this. Marianne looked at the box. I should have done it years ago. Yes, Evelyn said, simply, without cruelty. But you're doing it now. She put the copied papers into her satchel and stood. Marianne walked her to the back door. Outside, the cloud cover had thickened and the wind was picking up, the North Ridge sending its message about what was coming. Evelyn, Marianne said. She turned. Whatever happens at the hearing, Marianne said, make sure they understand it was deliberate. Not mistakes. Not misfilings. Her gray-blue eyes were very steady. Make sure everyone in that room knows it was deliberate, because the men who lost their land deserve to have someone say it out loud where people have to hear it. Evelyn looked at her. I will, she said. That's exactly what I'm going to do. She rode back to the Mercer Ranch with the satchel against her side and the wind pushing hard at her back. And when she came into the yard, Grant was at the gate before she'd fully stopped, reading her face the way he'd gotten good at reading her face. You got it, he said. I got it. She swung down from the horse. Her wrist was aching and she was cold through and she felt, not triumphant, which wasn't a word that fit how she actually felt. She felt like someone who had just picked up something very heavy and understood for the first time exactly what carrying it was going to require. Now what? Grant said. Now we wait for Aldred to set the hearing date. She looked at him. And we get everyone ready. He looked at her for a moment. Then he took her horse's reins from her hand and started toward the paddock, and he said over his shoulder, Go inside, there's coffee. You look like you need it. She stood in the yard for a moment in the wind. She went inside. The hearing was set for the 3rd week of October, which gave them 18 days. 18 days during which Conrad Voss discovered that the state land commissioner had been formally petitioned. 18 days during which the investigator Wharton filed his report, which arrived at the county seat the same morning that Dorothy Hines, who had indeed taken the situation very personally, ensured that the letter from the Davenport Title Company in St. Louis arrived promptly and without detour at the Mercer Ranch. The letter was 3 pages, signed by the firm's senior partner, documenting Evelyn's 4 years of employment and the resolution of the disputed property case in which she had been involved, resolved in favor of her client, her conduct cited as exemplary. Dorothy delivered it herself, on foot, which was not something she had done for anyone in living memory. Tell that woman Wharton's report is a piece of fiction, Dorothy said to Grant at the door, and then walked back to town without waiting for a response. Voss's next move came on a Monday, through his lawyer. A formal counterpetition to the commissioner challenging the standing of Grant Mercer to bring a multi-party claim, arguing that each property dispute was a separate matter requiring separate filings. It was a procedural argument, technically solid, designed to fragment what they'd built into pieces small enough to be handled one at a time. The same method, Grant thought, as everything else Voss did. Divide, reduce, make each piece seem manageable and isolated until the person dealing with it gave up. Evelyn read the counterpetition at the kitchen table with Nora Birch looking over her shoulder and Grant standing by the stove with his arms crossed. Can he do it? Grant said. He can try, Evelyn said. The commissioner has discretion on whether to consolidate claims if there's a demonstrable common pattern. She turned to the 2nd page, which is exactly what we have 14 pages of documentation proving. She set the petition down. He's hoping we don't know that. Do we respond? I already did. She picked up a draft from the side of the table and handed it to him. I wrote it last night. It goes to Aldred's office tomorrow. Grant took the papers. He read them. After a moment he said, You wrote this before the petition arrived. I wrote it before the petition was filed, she said, because it was the obvious move and I wanted to be ready. She looked at him steadily. The consolidated claim stands. Aldred will see that. He put the papers down. He looked at her across the table with an expression she'd come to understand as the one he wore when he was done arguing with a situation and had moved to accepting it. All right, he said. Nora picked up the counterpetition and read it herself. He's scared, she said. It was said with the flat satisfaction of someone who had been waiting a long time to say it. Evelyn looked at her. Don't let that make us careless. I know, Nora said. But she put the petition down with a firmness that said she was keeping the satisfaction anyway. The 2 weeks before the hearing had the quality of the last hours before a storm. Everything outwardly continuing, routines maintained, chores done, meals cooked, but a tension in the air that made ordinary things feel provisional. Grant repaired the east fence properly, all the way along the line, with a thoroughness that suggested he was working through something in his head that required physical occupation. Evelyn wrote letters and received them and kept her notes in the locked order she'd established. The evidence mapped in sequence so that at any moment she could put her hand on exactly the document she needed. Arthur Haynes wrote out twice to go over his account. He was meticulous about it in a way that told Evelyn the hearing had given him something to be meticulous about for the first time in years. Del Fogarty came once, sat at the kitchen table with his coffee, and said very little but listened to everything, and at the end said, "I'll be there. Whatever time you need me there, I'll be there." Thomas Birch sent a message through Nora that he and Ruth would attend, and that they had found 2 additional documents in a second trunk in the barn that they hadn't thought to look in before. Clara Pruitt wrote a letter in her cramped handwriting that said, "I am 72 years old, and I have been waiting a very long time to say what I know in a room where someone has to write it down. I will be there if it kills me." It nearly did. She arrived at the county seat on the morning of the hearing in a wagon driven by her neighbor's son, looking like she'd traveled farther than the miles actually accounted for. And she walked into the hearing room with her back straight and her blue tin trunk under her arm, and she sat down in the front row of chairs like she'd been saving that particular seat for 20 years. The hearing was held in the county seat's largest meeting room, a space normally used for municipal business, with rows of chairs and a long table at the front for the commissioner and his 2 appointed witnesses. Martin Aldred was a compact man in his 50s with a precise, unhurried manner that Evelyn had hoped for and been uncertain about until she saw him. He looked like someone who had spent a career in rooms where people tried to confuse him and had gotten very good at not being confused. Conrad Voss arrived with 2 lawyers. He sat at the respondents' table and looked at the room with the particular confidence of a man who had been the most powerful person in every room he'd walked into for a decade. He looked at Evelyn when she came in, and his expression was not contemptuous exactly, more like the expression of someone who has been told there's a problem and has not yet accepted that the problem is real. He did not look at Marianne, who sat in the 3rd row of chairs, alone, having arrived by hired wagon that morning without telling him she was coming. When he finally saw her, something happened in his face that he controlled quickly. But Grant saw it, and Evelyn saw it, and Aldred, who missed very little, appeared to see it. Grant sat next to Evelyn at the claimant's table. He'd put on his good jacket, and he looked exactly like what he was, a rancher who had built something and intended to keep it. And when Voss's lead lawyer opened with the procedural argument to separate the claims, Grant sat still and kept his face neutral and let Evelyn handle it, which she did in under 4 minutes, citing 3 specific sections of state land code and laying the 14 pages of pattern documentation on the commissioner's table without dramatics. Aldred read the first 3 pages and asked for the rest. That was the first moment Evelyn knew they were going to be all right. Not safe. Safe came later, after everything had been examined and weighed, but all right. Aldred was reading because he understood what he was reading. Voss's lawyer objected to the consolidated framework twice more. Aldred overruled both times, crisply, without apparent irritation, which was somehow more final than irritation would have been. Then Evelyn began. She had organized it the way she organized everything, by logic, by sequence, by what built on what. She started with the original boundary filings. She showed the pattern of amendments. She named Aldous Pratt and documented each survey he had altered and the properties affected. She presented Clara Pruitt's records and Arthur Haynes's account and Del Fogarty's testimony and the Birch documentation, each one corroborating the pattern from a different angle, each one another wall of the structure she'd been building for 3 months. She spoke without notes because she had put the notes in her head where she could trust them, and she spoke in the same even, factual tone she used when she wanted the facts to carry the weight. She was not performing. She was not angry, though she had reason to be. She was simply laying out a thing that was true and had documents to prove it was true and asking the room to see it clearly. The room was seeing it clearly. She could tell by the quality of the silence, not the polite silence of people waiting for something to end, but the working silence of people trying to process what they were hearing. Voss's lawyers objected periodically. Each objection was addressed. The morning moved into afternoon. Then she presented the copies from Marianne's documents. She watched Voss's face when the Pratt letters appeared on the commissioner's table. She watched him understand what he was looking at. She watched something shift behind his eyes. Not panic, not quite, because he was a controlled man, but the thing that preceded panic in a controlled man, the moment when the calculation changes and the numbers stop coming out right. His lawyer asked for a recess. Aldred granted 15 minutes. During the recess, Grant stood beside Evelyn near the window at the side of the room and said very quietly, "How are you doing?" She thought about it honestly. "Ask me in an hour." He nodded. He didn't tell her she was doing well, which she appreciated because she didn't need that, and he knew she didn't need it. "Voss is going to try something," he said. "When we reconvene, yes." "What?" "He's going to try me." She looked at the window. "He's going to use Wharton's report. He's going to try to make everything I've presented look like the work of someone with a personal agenda and a questionable history." Grant was quiet for a moment. "Then I'll answer it." Looked at him. "When he does it," Grant said, "I'll answer it." She looked at him for a moment longer than she meant to. He was looking at the window with his jaw set and his eyes forward, and he looked like a man who had made up his mind about something and was simply waiting for the moment to act on it. She looked away. "All right," she said. She was right about Voss. When the hearing reconvened, his lead lawyer spent 20 minutes on James Wharton's report, the allegation from St. Louis, the suggestion of a pattern of inserting herself into land disputes, the implication that everything she had presented was curated to serve an agenda she'd brought with her from Missouri. He was good at it. He framed it in the careful language of reasonable doubt, not accusing directly, just raising questions. Just enough questions that a person already uncertain might begin to wonder. She let him finish. Then she placed the Davenport title letter on the table. She placed the signed resolution documents from the St. Louis case beside it. She looked at Aldred and said simply, "Every specific claim in that report has documentation directly contradicting it. I'd ask the commissioner to review both." Aldred picked up the Davenport letter. Voss's lawyer pivoted. He said that regardless of Miss Cross's personal history, the question of her motive remained. She had come to Montana as a mail-order bride, been publicly rejected, and had since inserted herself into a complex legal matter that she had no legitimate standing in. He suggested that the entirety of the claim was built on a foundation of a woman acting out of wounded pride and personal grievance, and that the rancher who had initially rejected her was too personally compromised to see it clearly. The room was quiet. Grant stood up. He hadn't discussed exactly what he was going to say. Evelyn had known he was going to stand. He told her that. What he actually said she hadn't anticipated because Grant Mercer didn't script things. He said them. "I turned this woman away on the street the day she arrived," he said. His voice carried without effort, the voice of a man used to open spaces. "I did that because I was afraid of something I didn't have words for yet, and I dealt with it the way some men do, which is badly, and in public." He looked at Voss's lawyer. "She had every reason to leave. She stayed. She found in the first 2 weeks something that I had missed for 20 years on my own land. She found the same thing in Clara Pruitt's records and Arthur Haynes's records and the Birch family's records, and what she found isn't a story she invented. It's documented, and it's real, and it happened to real people who are sitting in this room right now." He looked at the commissioner. "The question of why she did what she did isn't relevant to whether what she found is true. It's true. The documents say it's true. I'd ask this room to look at the documents and not at the reason someone decided to bring them here." He sat down. The room was very quiet. Clara Pruitt, in the front row, made a small sound that was not quite a word. Evelyn looked at the table in front of her for a moment. Then she looked at Aldred. Aldred was looking at the documents. Voss spoke for the first time. Not through his lawyer, but directly, which was a mistake because it was the first crack in his composure, and everyone in the room saw it. He said that the surveys had been conducted by a licensed county surveyor, and that any discrepancies were matters of technical dispute, not fraud, and that he had acted in good faith on every property transaction he had ever been involved in, and that, "Mr. Voss," Aldred said, not unkindly, but with the finality of a man who has heard what he needed to hear. "I'll ask you to let your counsel speak on your behalf." Voss stopped. And in the stopping, in the sudden stillness of a man who had been the most powerful person in every room he'd entered for 10 years, and was no longer. Something in the room shifted. Evelyn felt it. Grant felt it. Del Fogarty, in the second row, put both hands on his knees and looked at the floor and took a slow breath. The hearing continued for another 2 hours. Aldred asked specific questions, sharp ones, that indicated he had read and understood the documentation and was now verifying specific points. He questioned Evelyn, he questioned Haynes, he questioned Thomas Birch. He asked Del Fogarty to confirm his account of the Fogarty survey, and Del did, in the quiet, controlled voice of a man who has rehearsed something so many times it has become as steady as breathing. Then Aldred asked if anyone else wished to address the commission. Marianne Voss stood up. Conrad turned to look at his wife. Whatever he saw in her face, it was enough that he didn't speak. He turned back to the front and didn't look at her again. Marianne stood at the front of the room and confirmed, in a clear and steady voice, that she had witnessed documents entering the locked box in her husband's study, documents matching those being described in the copies presented by Miss Cross. She confirmed the 1889 conversation between her husband and Aldous Pratt. She confirmed that she had seen the name Fogarty on a letter that was then locked in the box. She said it all in the same flat, determined tone she'd used when she told Evelyn she was very tired, and when she was done, she sat back down without looking at the table where her husband sat. The silence afterward had a different quality than any of the silences before it. Aldred called a brief recess and returned with a preliminary ruling. The consolidated claim was granted standing. The surveys in question were to be placed under state review. All current property claims involving Aldous Pratt's amendments were to be frozen pending investigation, and a formal inquiry into the conduct of 3 named county officials was to be opened. He stated clearly and for the record that the documentation presented demonstrated a pattern of deliberate fraud, not clerical error, and that the record would reflect that characterization. He said deliberate. Evelyn had asked for that, and he had given it without prompting because the documents asked for it. She sat at the table for a moment after the ruling and looked at the papers in front of her. The copies of Pratt's letters, the Birch records, Clara Pruitt's careful handwriting, all of it gathered and ordered and finally said out loud where someone had written it down. And she thought about her father, and the farm in Ohio, and the man who was still there, and still prosperous, and would probably always be those things because no one had found the right room at the right time with the right documents. She thought, this is what it looks like when it works. Remember this, because it doesn't always work, and you need to know what it looks like when it does. Then she picked up her papers, put them in the satchel, and stood up. The months that followed were not simple. Nothing that comes after a reckoning is simple. The state investigation took time, weeks of additional filings, correspondence, the grinding procedural machinery of official review. Voss's lawyers challenged the ruling twice. Both challenges failed, but they took time that Evelyn spent at the kitchen table with her pen and her notes, building the response to each challenge before it arrived the way she'd built the response to the counterpetition before it was filed. Conrad Voss did not go to prison. That was the hard truth that Evelyn held steady and didn't look away from. The fraud was documented, the investigation was real, his land claims collapsed, and his operation was dismantled piece by piece over 6 months. But the law moved at its own pace and through its own channels, and what it could prove in a courtroom was a narrower thing than what everyone in the valley knew. He was fined heavily. His remaining properties were subject to review. The county officials implicated in the scheme lost their positions. Aldous Pratt was formally censured, which came too late to matter to most people, but went into the official record, which was where Evelyn insisted it had to be. 3 of the original families had their land rights formally restored. Del Fogarty got back access to the water that had been diverted from him. The Birch family's sharecropping arrangement was dissolved when Voss's property claim on that parcel collapsed, and Thomas and Ruth Birch began the work of re-establishing an independent operation with the particular fierce energy of people who have been waiting to start over. Grant Mercer's southern boundary was restored to its original 1867 filing. The water rights lease was renewed without complication. The ranch that had been slowly bleeding stopped bleeding. Arthur Haynes did not get his land back. The property had been sold twice since Voss acquired it, and the legal complexity was, as Evelyn had known it might be, too tangled for a clean resolution. He got a settlement. It was not what he'd lost. He sat at Grant's kitchen table the afternoon they told him, with his coffee going cold in front of him, and he was quiet for a long time. "It's not enough," he said finally. "No," Evelyn said, "it's not. He looked at her. Is that? He stopped. Started again. Is that how it usually goes? Sometimes, not always. She looked at him directly. What you got is documented acknowledgement that it happened, that it was wrong, and that the man who did it paid something for it. That's not the same as whole, but it's not nothing. Haynes looked at his coffee. He didn't say anything else for a while. Then he said, I'd like to stay in touch. I'd like to know how things go here. You're welcome here any time, Grant said from across the table. Haynes nodded. He drank his cold coffee and didn't complain about it, and that small, stubborn dignity was the thing Evelyn remembered about him longest. Marianne Voss spent 2 weeks after the hearing in the house that had been her husband's, carefully inventorying what was hers, taking what was, leaving what wasn't, and conducting the entire process with the methodical precision of someone who had learned to be precise about what belonged to her, because for a long time nothing had. She left Red Hollow in November, heading east to a sister in Wisconsin whom she had been writing to for years, apparently in letters that had maintained the fiction of a good life while gradually containing more of the truth. She stopped at the Mercer Ranch the morning she left and sat at the kitchen table for an hour and drank good coffee and talked to Evelyn and Nora, and mostly didn't talk about any of the things that had happened, which was its own kind of conversation. When she left, she put her hand on Evelyn's arm for a moment. That was all. Nora Birch stayed on at the ranch through the winter and into the following spring, and nobody mentioned it as a temporary arrangement because it had stopped being one. She kept reorganizing things in ways that made practical sense and arguing with Grant about fence placement with a directness that he found either refreshing or aggravating depending on the day. She was good with horses in a way that was simply natural, and she had started talking about buying a small parcel when she had enough saved, and the way she talked about it, not hoping, just planning, told Evelyn she was going to do it. But Red Hollow changed in the way that small places change, slowly, incompletely, with the particular stubbornness of a community that has been set in its ways and doesn't change all at once but shifts, degree by degree, the way a compass needle adjusts. Dorothy Hines had always been a fixture. She became something closer to a guardian, and she wore it without drama, but with considerable satisfaction. Clara Addison was exactly the same as she'd always been, which, in retrospect, was what she'd always been doing, holding the social fabric of the town steady with her coffee and her precise observations and her ability to say the most important things without appearing to have said them at all. The townspeople who had watched Evelyn get turned away on the main street in June were the same people who watched her walk down that same street in December, and some of them found small ways to account for the distance between those two moments. A nod from Pete Calloway that had more in it than a nod usually holds. A way that Dorothy Hines said her name that contained an apology she would never frame as one. Evelyn accepted it all without making anything of it, because making something of it would have required holding on to June, and June had done what it needed to do. Grant fixed the plaster crack above the kitchen table in November. It was a small thing. He mixed the plaster himself, did it on a Tuesday afternoon while Evelyn was at Clara Addison's going over some of the remaining documentation, and when she came back, the crack was gone and the wall was smooth, and he was cleaning his hands on a rag by the door. She looked at the ceiling and then at him. "Been meaning to do that," he said. "I know," she said. She took off her coat and sat down at the table and started on the correspondence. And he went back to whatever he'd been doing before, and neither of them said anything else about it. But it was the kind of small thing that means something larger when you're paying attention. It was December, the first real cold of winter, the stove working properly now that its damper had been replaced, the leaking east wing roof sealed before the snow, when Grant said what he said. It wasn't a planned moment. Evelyn had not been expecting it, which was probably why it arrived the way it did. They were sitting on opposite sides of the kitchen table, which was where most of the important things between them had happened, and Evelyn had put down her pen and was looking at nothing in particular with the slightly blank expression she got when she'd been working for too many hours, and her mind had started to drift. Grant said, "I think I fell in love with you on the street the day you arrived." She looked at him. He looked back. His jaw wasn't tight. His expression wasn't the closed, forward-facing expression she'd first known. It was open in the way of something that has stopped being defended, and it was a little rough at the edges because honesty without preparation usually is. "I panicked," he said. "That's what happened. You stepped off that stage and I panicked, and I did what I did because I didn't know what else to do with something that felt that large that fast. He paused. That doesn't make it right. I know it doesn't make it right. He looked at the table. I'm telling you the truth of it. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at him across the table, this man who had driven her to fence lines as far as the road, and put wood on the fire and fixed the crack in the plaster and stood up in a hearing room and said the thing that needed to be said without having rehearsed it. I stayed, she said, because I saw what you actually were, under the fear. She held his gaze. A fair man. A man who acknowledges when he's been wrong and doesn't make a speech out of it. She paused. Someone who gets things right without knowing he's being watched. He looked at her. That's a hard thing to walk away from, she said. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the first snow of the season was coming down in the particular quiet way of heavy snow. No wind, just a steady descent that muffled everything and made the ranch feel like the only place in the world for a while. Grant said, I'd like you to stay. Not as an arrangement, not as a practical matter. He meant it the way it sounded, and they both knew it, and Evelyn looked at him across the table and thought about Ohio and St. Louis and 4 states and 11 days and the bridge support on the canyon grade that she'd noticed, because she noticed things. And she thought about what it meant to find a place where noticing things was valued rather than managed. I'm already staying, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then something happened in his face that she didn't try to name. It was too honest to name, too much itself. He looked like a man who had braced for a long time against something cold and had just come inside. She picked up her pen. He put more wood on the stove. The snow came down outside in the dark. It wasn't a clean ending. Life on a working ranch in Montana in the 1890s didn't produce clean endings. It produced the next season's work, and the season after that, and the ongoing negotiation of 2 people who had arrived at the same place by very different roads and were still, in small ways, learning the other's language. Grant was not easy. He went silent when he was worried and sometimes didn't say what he meant until 3 days after he meant it, which drove Evelyn to a particular level of controlled frustration she'd never experienced before. She was not easy either. She kept things to herself as a first instinct and had to consciously override it, and she was blunt in ways that sometimes landed harder than she'd intended, and she had a habit of being right that was occasionally insufferable. They were imperfect people who had done a hard thing together and were now going to do the harder thing of building a life with the actual materials available, which were imperfect, same as them. The ranch became what it should have been, not because everything was fixed overnight. The east fence needed work again by spring. There was a dry summer that made the south pasture difficult, a debt that took 2 years to fully clear. But because the land was secure and the people working it gave a real care to what they were building, which is the only actual foundation for anything. By spring, 6 of the 11 families on Evelyn's original list had had their situations formally reviewed. 3 had clear resolutions. 2 were still being worked through channels that moved slowly and required patience that cost something every day. 1, Arthur Haynes, had his settlement and his documentation and his seat at Grant's table whenever he wanted it, which turned out to be fairly often. The valley was not free. That was the honest thing to say about it. A man like Conrad Voss leaves a mark that outlasts his operation, and the county still had officials who remembered which way the wind had blown for a decade and were learning slowly, under new pressure, to turn towards something else. It was going to take time. It was going to take people paying attention in the way that Evelyn paid attention, and there were not always such people available. But the Mercer Ranch was clear. The water rights were filed and current. The boundary ran where it had always been meant to run, along the line that Grant's grandfather had staked out and that had been quietly stolen and had now been quietly returned. That winter, the first winter Evelyn spent fully as part of the ranch rather than adjacent to it, she sat by the stove on an evening in January and looked at the kitchen that had become familiar in the way that a place becomes familiar when you stop thinking about it as temporary. The plaster above the table was smooth and white. The ledger was organized on the shelf. The ink stain on her left index finger was permanent. She'd accepted this. The tools were in the shed in the order that made sense, which she had put them in and Nora had refined and Grant had eventually acknowledged made sense by never moving anything back. Grant was outside doing something with the gate latch again. It was an ongoing negotiation between him and that latch, And the sound of it came through the wall in the particular way that the sounds of someone specific become distinct, become themselves after enough time. She thought about her father. She thought about Ohio and the farm and the man who had done to them what Conrad Voss had done to the people of this valley. She thought about being 16 years old and understanding for the first time that the world could be arranged against you by someone who knew how to use the arrangements. She thought about 4 years in title work, learning to see the machinery of it, learning to find the fault lines. She thought, that happened, and it was wrong, and it made you into someone who could do this. Both things are true, and you don't have to choose between them. The gate latch made a sound of being finally, provisionally solved. Grant came in from the cold, pulling the door shut behind him. He looked at the stove, at her, at the organized kitchen that had been chaos when she arrived. The latch is fixed, he said. Again, she said. For good this time. She looked at him. You said that in September. He sat down across from her. His face had the trace of cold on it, the particular realness of someone who has just come in from Montana in January. He looked at her with the open expression that had replaced the closed one, the one she'd watched arrive gradually and settle in like something that had always meant to be there. I mean it this time, he said. She looked at the table. She looked at the plaster above it, smooth and white. I know you do, she said. Outside, the snow was on the ground, and the valley was quiet in the way it got in deep winter. Not empty, but resting, holding its breath before the work of spring. The ranch sat in that quiet, solid, and paid for and built by the particular combination of stubbornness and competence and imperfect love that is the only real way anything lasting gets made. There is a thing people say about second chances, that you have to earn them, that they don't come free. What they don't always say is that the earning isn't just about the obvious mistake, the public thing, the moment on the street where a man panicked and showed himself badly. The real earning is quieter and longer. It's showing up for the fence line and the hearing room and the cold morning when someone needs coffee made and the evening when someone needs to be told the truth without decoration. It's learning to say you can tell me things and meaning it. It's fixing the latch and fixing the plaster and standing up in a room full of people and saying what needs to be said because the person beside you deserves to have it said. It doesn't produce a perfect life. It produces a real one, which is harder to build and worth considerably more. Grant Mercer had spent 42 years building walls around the thing he was most afraid of losing. Evelyn Cross had spent 34 years learning to find what was hidden behind the walls other people built. They were, in that way, exactly suited to each other. Not easily, not without cost, but in the specific and irreplaceable way of two people who see each other clearly and stay anyway. The Montana winter pressed at the windows. The stove put out steady heat. The land outside was theirs and proven and secure, and the life inside was under construction the way real lives always are, imperfect and ongoing and despite everything worth the trouble.